Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Nina Chennai, a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and my colleague, Brookings Senior Fellow Josh Meltzer, and I are just so pleased to welcome you and our distinguished speakers to our joint AEI Brookings program on next steps at the World Trade Organization and U.S. trade policy in the Biden administration. Our program is part of a joint nonpartisan project that Josh and I have been working on now for several years, titled Reconceptualizing Globalization. And our project seeks to bring innovative thinking to improve the understanding of global trade issues, as well as their importance to growth and jobs, as well as the impacts of globalization on the US and global economy. Well, needless to say, it is a challenging time for global trade these days. The politics of trade have just been so complicated for so many years in countries around the world, including the United States. But they've been further changed and turned on their head, really, in this changed pandemic-shaped world. And while in the past, trade issues would occasionally make the news, they are now routinely front-page issues, from the massive supply chain delays that we're seeing these days to the use of sanctions, which are really a foreign policy tool of choice. So in short, there've just really been tectonic shifts that have been occurring in this space. So in this regard, we're just delighted to have with us so many preeminent speakers for a two-part program. First, we are going to focus on the World Trade Organization and the status of the rules-based global trading system, and then turn to a stock taking of the Biden administration's trade policy. So first, Josh and I will have a conversation with Angela Ellard, Deputy Director General at the WTO. And I'm just thrilled to have Angela with us. Angela has been a DDG at the WTO now for about 6 months, after a long career on Capitol Hill, serving as chief counsel, both for the minority and majority, depending on timing, for the Republicans, for Ways and Means on the Trade Subcommittee. And I have to say, I had the pleasure of serving on Capitol Hill with Angela for several years. So thank you, Angela, so much for joining us today. Angela's participation in this event is especially timely given the postponement of the 12th Ministerial Conference at the WTO that had been slated to occur last week. And we're looking forward to talking with Angela about the outlook for the WTO, as well as her early impressions in Geneva, given her experience on Capitol Hill. So thank you again, Angela. We'll then switch gears in our program into a second portion of the event. It's titled Strategic Re-engagement or Drift, Assessing U.S. Trade Policy 1 year into the Biden administration, with a panel of preeminent trade experts. Josh will introduce these experts, and we'll have a conversation with the panelists and also have a Q&A session. So with that, with no further ado, let's kick off this conversation with Angela. Angela, again, thanks so much for joining us from Geneva. I think most of us were really very disappointed with the WTO's postponement of MC12 last week due to the health conditions surrounding this new COVID variant, especially since the WTO has not had a ministerial conference since 2017. And we know that just reported out that there have been so many conversations happening in the run up to this MC12 ministerial on trade and health framework, the services, domestic regulations talk, fisheries, but really stepping back here, what do you see as really what's next for the WTO after this postponement of MC12?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Nina. And it's a great pleasure to be here today with you. We've known each other for many, many years, and with Josh as well. Thanks to AEI and Brookings for putting this program on. And before we started, I was delighted to see some old friends in the panel that you have next. So it was good to see faces. A little homesick sometimes over here in Geneva, always looking to see my good friends. So on MC12, yes, tremendous disappointment that we had to postpone it. And I would emphasize it's postponed and not canceled. We certainly do intend to keep on with our work. The night that we announced the postponement, we had gathered together all of our members to talk about Omicron, which had just less than 24 hours before had surfaced, and various in Switzerland, a number of countries were not, flights could not come to Switzerland from those countries. And if they did, they'd have to quarantine. For some of them, it was an outright ban. For others, a quarantine. So it made it impossible, really, to have a conference of a negotiating type conference of the kind that we were looking to have. It would not have been fair to those who could not make it. There were legal issues concerning that as well. It was just not inclusive, and it wasn't safe with what we knew at that point. But one thing that was very gratifying was in that late Friday evening meeting that we had with our members, that member after member took the floor to say how disappointed they were, that it was the right decision, but that they really wanted to continue the momentum. And many of them spoke about the need for the WTO members, for the ministers to empower their ambassadors to do more negotiating here in Geneva. And they all expressed an interest in keeping the work going. I think that there are really two primary issues, but there are other issues as well, where our work, the momentum in our work must be maintained. So first of all, the response to the pandemic. It's ironic that a conference that was going to spend a lot of time focused on the response to the pandemic had to be postponed because of the pandemic. But like I said, it just wasn't safe to travel. So we do intend to continue our work on two tracks. One relates to the waiver of intellectual property rights that India and South Africa have proposed. And I can speak more about any of these issues as you see fit. The second related issue has to do with what kinds of tools can the WTO, through trade, what can we do to help facilitate trade during the pandemic with response to, concerning the response to the pandemic. So in particular, we want to continue our work regarding supply chain bottlenecks, restraints to trade, various things that governments can implement to either make trade with respect to the pandemic harder or easier. So relating to vaccines, to therapeutics, to diagnostics, everything that goes into the supply chain for these products. So the response to the pandemic is one important area. Another important area is fisheries negotiations, negotiations addressing subsidies that are provided by various governments for their fishing sectors. This is an incredibly important issue because so much of fish stocks are now in a state of crisis and are overfished. When we began these negotiations 21 years ago, some 17% of fish stocks were in jeopardy. They were overfished. At this point, it's anywhere between 40 and even 50%. So the situation has gotten even more acute. It's also an important economic and humanitarian issue because so many people depend on fishing for their livelihoods, as well as a protein source. So this is something that's long overdue, and we have been making so much momentum over the last 6 weeks, I would say, but particularly in the last 2 weeks running up to the negotiations, up to MC12. So those are things that we need to do. But work continues. We had a series of meetings last week on all of these topics, and we have areas where work has been completed. We just had an announcement last Friday about the Services Domestic Regulation Initiative, which has been finalized by 67 members. And we've also completed work on small economies, on the moratorium on the TRIPS non-violation, and lots of other work that's well underway.
Angela, thanks. That's a really helpful overview of the range of very substantive work that is underway in Geneva at the WTO. There's one of the questions, I just want to sort of step back from some of the details and get into them in a minute, but a lot of the outcomes there are potentially going to be plurilateral in nature. You mentioned domestic services regulation. You didn't talk about the discussions around e-commerce, and to the extent you can provide an update on that would be helpful. But my broader question is the direction of the WTO and the future of the WTO in terms of making progress on these discrete sets of issues. Are we in a world now where it will be an increasingly sort of plurilateral groupings of countries that want to move forward? Is there a scope for a broader set of multilateral sort of all-member outcomes? How do you sort of see that playing out over time? And anything you want to say on the e-commerce part as well would be very, very interesting. Thanks.
Sure. Well, on the whole issue of multilateralism, plurilateralism, regionalism, it's a very interesting issue. Some people see these as not being able to coexist, but I think they actually do coexist quite well. And there is a lot of mutual reinforcement. It's not a dichotomy. Instead, I think that they support the different forms support each other. And for some negotiations, a particular format is good. For others, a different format is better. But they do coexist and complement each other, I think, very readily. I mean, the reality is in the WTO, we have a consensus rule, which means 164 members have to agree on everything in order for it to proceed. That's difficult. But at the same time, once you get that kind of support, you really have buy-in from everyone, a true multilateral agreement. But on the other hand, the plurilaterals are more like a coalition of the willing, getting together those members who believe in a certain approach. Now, there is a healthy debate that's going on right now about the legality of plurilaterals, with India and South Africa, for example, challenging whether a plurilateral can exist in the WTO under what circumstances, while others believe that plurilaterals can move forward under the rules. So we also have regional trade agreements which are permitted in the WTO. Those are what we call the free trade agreements as well, bilateral trade agreements by another name. And those also provide a good opportunity to advance multilateral work. Quite often, regional trade agreements can be more ambitious than we can do in a multilateral setting. And sometimes they prime the pump for particular issues. They can often go beyond issues that are covered in WTO agreements. For example, 72% of regional trade agreements contain provisions on competition, 60% on environment and subsidies, 33% on e-commerce, and 34% on labor. And these all go beyond WTO rules and set standards that who knows, could be a way to address these issues in the future in a multilateral context. I would also argue that multilateralism is still really the only way to go when it comes to issues of the global commons. So when we're talking about fisheries subsidies, for example, or a single instrument for carbon pricing, there's been a lot of discussion about negotiating something like that in the context of the WTO. Those really can only be addressed multilaterally. But I think that the bottom line is that the future isn't plurilateral or multilateral. It belongs to agreements of variable geometries. Now, I would say, just in terms of your question on e-commerce, Josh, there is a very robust negotiation that's ongoing with respect to e-commerce. And they're making a lot of progress in that context. Of course, that's more plurilateral. But the countries that are engaged in that are hoping to have more and more WTO members involved. We also have the question with respect to the moratorium on e-commerce. I don't know if you were asking about that as well. That is a multilateral issue. We have a moratorium on duties on e-commerce that expires at the end of MC12. And there is a strong effort by many to extend that moratorium, either for until the next ministerial, MC13, or for a permanent period. We have other WTO members who don't support that and who are looking for a work program on e-commerce to address the digital divide in lieu of the moratorium, because they believe that the moratorium is not the right way to go because it results in a revenue loss for countries that are behind in the digital divide. So we've got several e-commerce type issues that are circulating.
Thanks so much, Angela, for that. Those really interesting comments. I want to take you back to the structural issues that you were talking about, and just really the opportunities and risks, so to speak, to both the global trading system as well as the regional trade approaches and plurilateral approaches. I think it's safe to say the WTO has had many challenges over the last several years, both structurally and substantively. And we'd love to hear any thoughts that you have on whether we need to think through how international trade rules are negotiated, and the consensus-based system that you mentioned.
Well, the consensus-based system is the heart and soul of the WTO. It's the way the system was set up, which makes it harder to reach agreements. But as I was saying earlier, when you do, then you really have this buy-in among the members. And I guess I would say, what really is the WTO? The WTO is the 164 members. It is not, yes, we are a secretariat, but we carry out the will of the members. So when this kind of relates, Nina, I think the question that you're asking in terms of consensus and structure, it relates to how many WTO members view the question of WTO reform. But when we are talking about changing, if we are talking about changing anything about the WTO, it has to reach, you have to have consensus in order to do that. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that the members are the WTO. So for there to be a change in the process, a change in the way of doing things, that has to emanate from the members. And right now, I think there really are very different views about how we should be addressing issues. And it's not even really just a question of consensus. That is the framework, the structure that we have. But when you talk about the individual issues that we're looking at, whether it's response to the pandemic or fisheries or agriculture, or some of the issues in other contexts that we're trying to address. The question is, what do members want to do, and what are the themes that members are considering? I would say one of the big themes that pervades really all of our negotiations has to do with the difference between developed and developing countries, and to what extent, who takes on what obligations and when, I guess is a way to put it. That should there be special and differential treatment for developing countries? I think most agree on that. But what should that S&DT treatment involve? Is it taking on the same obligations, but with more transition periods? Is it taking on different obligations or no obligations at all? Is it providing technical assistance and capacity building to developing countries to help them meet the obligations? And I think it really depends on the context as to how we answer that question. But it is a huge focus of the debate. It's a big focus on fisheries. It's a big focus on response to the pandemic. It's a big focus on agriculture. Just to name 3 key examples. I would say there's another issue too relating to trust. We're able to work as the WTO only to the extent that there's trust among our members. So that's always a challenge to make sure that we have that trust. It's difficult sometimes when we're talking about new negotiations. But when we're talking about things like the monitoring function, I think there the WTO has actually been doing very well. We've had several trade policy review mechanisms that occurred just within the last 6 weeks or 1 month, including China, Russia, and Kazakhstan. And there are others to come in the new year as well. And this is a routine process that we go through. Every country has to sit down and explain itself and answer questions by other members. The US will have its TPR next year. So that's a very important milestone, and I think helps build trust. We need more transparency in the WTO. And our monitoring function is a way of making sure that, that WTO members understand the policies that others are undertaking, and they have an opportunity to question them. Of course, then we also have dispute settlement, but that's a whole nother issue as well.
Well, Angela, let me actually pick you up then on dispute settlement, the third leg, I guess, of the system. It doesn't seem like there's an obvious pathway to reinvigorating the appellate body at this stage, at least. How important is this set of issues at the moment amongst the membership? How does it play out when one thinks about the questions around negotiation and monitoring and these other functions of the WTO? What's your view of how this may move forward over the next period of time?
Well, I think it's very true to say that WTO rules, whether they are new or old, have only a limited usefulness if they can't be enforced. They are good. Having rules is good as a nominative matter, as a qualitative matter. But if they can't be enforced, then many justifiably question how valuable they really are. I'm sorry, not nominative, I meant normative, a normative value. Now, yes, we have this situation in which the appellate body is no longer functioning. And you all certainly know, and I imagine the audience knows quite well, the long history there. The US has raised issues for quite some time. I think that WTO members, perhaps other WTO members, perhaps initially did not really take the US too seriously. But I think that's changed a lot. And we have seen a lot more responsiveness to the questions that the US raised. So last week, we had a meeting of the Dispute Settlement Body, which is, well, it lives up to its name. It handles the dispute settlement issues. And there was a discussion, again, as there is every month, about the appellate body and the resolution by Mexico, which is co-sponsored by some 100 members, supportive of naming new appellate body members. The US routinely has blocked that resolution. So at this point, we're hoping that there will be continued discussion, more active discussion even, about what the next step is. But it's really something the members have to decide. It's not something the Secretariat can really, we can't really make suggestions or direct the discussion in any way. Of course, we would facilitate any discussion that members would want to have, but it's really up to them to figure out why the appellate body went wrong and how to fix it. I just have to emphasize how important it is to resolve this issue. So many of our WTO members have said this is existential to them, to have this third leg of the stool operating in a way that gives meaning to the rules. Having the dispute settlement mechanism underpinning the rules is such an important thing. So we're hopeful that the discussions on this can begin in earnest. I think it was pretty clear for quite some time this year that reaching a resolution on these issues by the time of MC12 was not going to be possible because the members just weren't there yet. But maybe with a little bit more time, that can start to happen. It's not going to happen overnight, though. I think there really has to be a discussion on what the goals are and trying to figure out how we make this happen. But like I said, the US hasn't been willing to discuss this in the past. But at the dispute settlement meeting last week, they said, as they have now said for the last couple of months, that they do look forward to these discussions. So talk is important. And we really have to see that dialogue among members. But this is a very important issue that we really do need to resolve.
Thanks for that, Angela. And I'm sure there'll be more discussion about this issue in our panel. I guess we have a few more minutes with you, and wanted to turn to your perspectives on the WTO, just given your experience and your personal experience on Capitol Hill. You've been with the WTO now 6 months, and so just really curious to get your thoughts, I guess, on two issues. One, What do you think is the greatest misperception in the US/Capitol Hill about the WTO? And kind of the second piece, what can the WTO do? You've talked a lot about the member-driven nature of the organization, but what else can the WTO institutionally do to build support with Capitol Hill, the Biden administration, as well as the American public?
Well, that's an interesting question. I do think there are some misperceptions in the US about the WTO. One is that it's a monolithic organization, that it is this body that independently makes decisions that sometimes don't serve the US interest. That a related perception, I think, is that the US feels that as a big member, it should be able to have a lot of sway. So I think one of the big perceptions, therefore, is that the outcomes, what the WTO does, should be more reflective of the US view, because the US is such a big player. Now, the US, of course, punches above its weight in the WTO. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, it's one of 164 members. So in reaching consensus, the US has to get the buy-in of its fellow members in order to reach a result. I think that sometimes that's hard. I know when I was on the Hill, I would often hear the view, well, why can't we change this? And it's a very understandable view to have until you see how the WTO works in having everyone come together. Everyone is a player, and having some have more ability perhaps to influence others, but still at the end of the day, we're an organization of the members, and the members all have that equal standing. And I think that's a misperception sometimes, not just in the US, but everywhere as well. Then your second question, what can the WTO do to build support on Capitol Hill and with the administration and with the American public? And again, it's a question of what can the WTO do? In other words, what can the WTO members do? Every time I think WTO, I try to think the WTO members. And but I do, to take your question more broadly, how can we build support for trade more broadly, not just in the US, but all over the world, in developing countries, in developed countries? And I think there, the important things are to show the value of trade, how trade, for example, during the pandemic, although it did go down, it actually has started to come back up again, that trade is a force for good, that it can help ease the bottlenecks caused by the pandemic, even in terms of access to medicines, certainly access to food, to other vital goods. We need to have trade. Trade can also be a force for good, and the WTO is part of this if we negotiate rules that are directed at the common good. So fish subsidies is an important aspect. Of course, our response to the pandemic is another important aspect. So showing that the WTO is in the midst of these issues. There's also been a lot of discussion about getting the WTO more involved in the environment, even to addressing climate change in a way that represents a consensus among members, doing things like looking at carbon pricing, for example. And then one last thing I would say is that the WTO's value in setting the rules that are agreed to by its members is just so important. And then requiring the accountability and the transparency that comes with the WTO system, and ultimately dispute settlement too. I think that's all part of the equation as well. And our dispute settlement system is actually still working, even if we don't have an appellate body. At the dispute settlement body meeting last week, we had 2 new cases brought. So that shows, I think, that the WTO has a very important role to play. And if we look at it, not just from the perspective of individual countries, but that obviously that's important, but for the global commons as well, a process for bringing very diverse members together to sit at the table, to negotiate rules, to hold each other accountable through monitoring, and then ultimately through dispute settlement. That's really what we're about and what our members are about.
Angela, thank you so much for your time and for providing such a comprehensive set of answers to our questions. It's very much appreciated. We're obviously very keen with the success of the WTO, and we're thrilled that you are in Geneva to contribute to that. And I really enjoyed, your repeated emphasis on the role of the WTO in addressing issues of global concern and that affect the global commons. And you mentioned subsidies. You've spoken quite a bit about climate change, interestingly, and I'm sorry we don't have the time to get into that in more detail, because I think that is clearly going to be an area of preeminence for the trading system going forward. But I think you're obviously laying some groundwork there, which is great to hear as well. So on behalf of Nina and myself, I'd like to say thank you very much for the time and for your discussion, your presentation.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. Great to see you both. And very interesting dialogue. I enjoyed your questions. Makes me think in a fresh way. So I appreciate that. Good luck with the rest of your program.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Angela.
Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to the second part of our event. And if I can invite all the panelists to turn on their screens, I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists and then tee up the panel, and then we'll get into some Q&A. Just before I do start, please, if you are in the audience and you want to ask the panelists any questions, the best way to do that is submit questions to John Konecki. His email address was in the event flyer, but his email is john.konecki, KONICKI @aei.org, or on Twitter at #AskAEIECon. That's #AskAEIECon. With that, we've got a great panelist. Angela Ellert has, I think, sowed the ground with a lot of very important and interesting sets of issues, and we'll get into them and go further in other non-WTO related areas. But briefly, just to introduce my panelists, and just in advance, panelists, you have such incredibly long and accomplished bios that I'm going to not do them justice, because I'm going to try to summarize for the sake of getting into the actual conversation. Starting with Kathy Clausen, who is professor at University of Miami Law School, where her research focuses on trade, investment, international labor, and administrative law issues surrounding US foreign relations. And prior to joining the Miami Law faculty, Professor Clausen, Kathy, was Associate General Counsel at USTR, where she represented USTR in various dispute settlement proceedings. And earlier in her career, she was also legal counsel at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, and served as law clerk before that to David Hamilton at the Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. Moving to Jennifer Hillman, who is currently a professor of practice at the Georgetown Law Center, where she teaches courses in international business and international trade, and is also a fellow of Georgetown's Institute of International Economic Law. She's had a very extensive public service as well, including as Appellate Body member at the WTO. Before that, she was also a commissioner at the United States International Trade Commission for 9 years, and before that, General Counsel at USTR. She's also served as Legislative Director and Counsel for Senator Terry Sanford of North Carolina. Greg Schaefer is Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. He's a world-renowned expert on law and globalization, specializes in international trade law. He's published numerous books and articles. I would highly recommend his newest book, Emerging Powers and the World Trading System, The Past and Future of International Economic Law. He's also President-elect of the American Society of International Law. And last but certainly not least is John Verenow, who's Senior Counsel at Covington, where he chairs the firm's International Trade Practice Group. He has also held a variety of public service roles, including as Ambassador and Deputy USTR under President George W. Bush, as well as serving as USTR General Counsel. He also, under President Clinton, served as Assistant Secretary of Defense, and prior to that, had various roles in Capitol Hill, including as Legislative Director to Senator Bill Cohen, Legislative Director to Majority Leader Bill Frist, and Chief of Staff to Senator Susan Collins. So with that, let me do my best to very briefly summarize where maybe the administration's trade policy is at post 4 years of the Trump administration. I think broadly speaking, the stated philosophy, and this is beyond trade, but I think in looking internationally, is to work with allies to support multilateralism, definitely trying to build international cooperation where feasible, and particularly working with allies on key challenges. On the trade policy front, where that's manifested, I guess we've seen a combination of things. One is clearing away disputes, particularly with allies. So we saw the Boeing Airbus dispute being resolved, and a move to get rid of the steel and aluminium tariffs in Europe and so forth. But we've also seen a continuing, I think, pretty hard line on the trade front with respect to China. All the tariffs more or less have been kept in place. I know there's a more updated exclusion process happening, and certainly on other domestic trade-related issues, particularly around Buy America supply chain issues and use of sanctions. I think the administration has been pretty forward on that as well. In this mix, we've also seen Secretary Raimondo recently talk about a new Indo-Pacific framework, which is inclusive and flexible, but is not a trade deal. But so curious what that might look like. We might get into that as well. And staying in the Indo-Pacific region, things are not remaining still. Obviously, particularly China is increasingly a party to all the major trade agreements, or seeking to join the major trade agreements, having just recently announced it wants to join the CPTPP, which we will recall was originally very much a US initiative with 11 other countries in the Asia-Pacific region, but which the Trump administration pulled the US out from in his first week of office. So the net result being the US is not present really in major regional trade deals in the Asia-Pacific, while China is increasingly there. And that's obviously a bigger part of the US-China competition. What does the US do about that? Having said all that, let me turn it over now to the panelists and just ask you, how do you see the US, the administration's trade policy so far? What has it achieved? Where is it falling short? What's its trajectory? It's a broad question, but I think it's useful to open broadly. If any of you want to take that initially, please just raise your hand or just unmute yourself, and we can go from there. Jennifer.
Well, I'll start. You asked early in the questions, sort of how do you grade the Biden administration so far? And so let me, since I'll put on my professor hat and give a little bit of a grade, I would say in terms of what they are saying, I would give the administration very high marks. I think both in terms of what is being said about their approach to the WTO, what was being said in the speech that Ambassador Tai gave about China. I think the rhetoric is very good. Then when you come over to the, kind of what's really happened, I would give them a complete incomplete. In other words, we do not know. So what is going to be really important to look for is, what does the United States actually do in terms of stepping up to reform the WTO? Again, a lot of expressions of support, but that's got to then translate into actual action on the ground, where the U.S. assert some real leadership to bring countries together to make it happen. And that's what we haven't seen yet.
Anyone else want to come in on that?
I would just add to Jennifer's comments, and I agree with her that on the incomplete, when Ambassador Tai gave us, her first, big speech, probably about a month ago now, on China policy, I think most people had a sense that it was a perfectly sound speech if it was delivered last spring, but delivered at this point in time, I think there was an expectation that there would be more there. In fairness to Ambassador Tai, though, I think the administration is moving quite cautiously on the China front and the trade front. And China obviously is a great issue. I think in part because there's probably some division within the administration, but I think they also rightfully want to put trade policy in a broader strategic context. And that's a very complicated landscape right now with China. And so the caution is frustrating to some of us that would like to see the administration move on certain aspects of the last administration's trade policy. But I think the caution is understandable.
Greg.
Sure. So I agree exactly the way Jennifer put it, which is that on the diplomatic front, I'd give it very high marks. But in terms of actually major policies vis-a-vis the WTO and China, we just simply don't know. And I think we have to just put on the table that even though Ambassador Tai has indicated that she would like to see WTO dispute settlement, binding, neutral, impartial process reinstated, the US still has yet to make any proposal, any specific proposal in terms of what it wants. And that's a real problem because it's undermining the rule of law for international trade, which in my view is not in the US interest nor in the world's.
Josh, I'll just add one short thing here, which I think the impression that we have in the trade law community is a lot of maybe disappointment, and sort of, and as others have said, we're waiting, a lot of impatience, sort of where is the policy on these big things. But I think if we look at some of the other metrics that have sort of been mentioned, if we score instead by asking, has the administration been consistent with promises made before inauguration? Yes, if we score by ability to resolve at least some disputes and enforce the rules, not too bad. If we look at what's realistic in a pandemic and a very tumultuous domestic political environment, again, not too bad. So I had the same sort of concerns that others have raised, but I think our score, our definition of success is really largely a matter of where one sits, of course. And those who are benefiting from the tariffs, they love them, they want them to continue. That's a big success for them. So a lot to be said, I think, about the calibration of the scorecard.
Fair enough. Nina, over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks for those comments. I think you all have covered really succinctly sort of where things are. And I can throw out there, what do you think? Kathy mentioned the word success. What do you all see as a successful path forward, or a successful definition, a definition of success on trade for this administration? Because you see, the comments of trying to situate the U.S. trade policy in this concept of foreign policy for the middle class. What does this mean for the administration?
I don't know what order you want to go in, but I guess since we started in this order, I'll continue. I mean, to me, it's very clear that from a trade perspective, Catherine Tai has now said it so many times that I think everybody really needs to hear it, that their version of success, I think, is really whether we end up with a worker-centric trade policy and that we actually implement one. And then I think if you look at sort of what did she say, in her comments about where the WTO needs to head, again, it is picking up on this notion that the WTO needs to become an institution that can prove that it is doing something worthwhile for working people, that it is the WTO is engaged in those kind of public goods, as Angela Ellard was describing it. So then to me, it comes back to sort of two basic variables. So what is a worker-centric trade policy? And again, I have and others have some thoughts on that. And then secondly is, whether the United States can do, the other sort of aspect of their policy notions is to not engage in any trade negotiations unless and until the US gets its domestic house in order. So unless and until we have built back better, again, armed our workers, our companies to be more competitive, to be ready to compete, we shouldn't be engaging in more outside, sort of trade activities. So just to back up, I mean, success for them may be the implementation of a worker-centric trade policy, which, again, I think we're still waiting a little bit to see exactly what does that mean, but I think we have some indications. At a bare minimum, I think it does mean that trade liberalization as a principle in and of itself is not necessarily among the goals. I mean, that's not going to be what we say, oh, great, we've achieved trade liberalization. Secondly, to me, I think you're seeing this notion that you should be implementing the USMCA kind of provisions with respect to labor. And I think it's important to remember how unique those were. I mean, all other trade agreements that had anything connected to labor in them, focused on governmental policies and whether a government was in general, in enforcing its own labor laws. This is really different because it's now saying we're going to go into an individual plant and figure out whether there are significant labor violations in that individual plant. And if so, we are going to ban imports from that individual plant. That's a very different way of thinking about how a trade agreement can approach labor issues, labor violations. So again, I think you'll see more of that. You're obviously seeing this notion that you have to be more supportive of Buy America requirements. Again, as part of this worker-centric trade policy, you're seeing, again, some real push on what are we going to do about supply chain security. And last but not least, as I mentioned, is going to be this notion of we've got to do Build Back Better first. The problem, I think, for the administration is going to be a little bit of what Josh touched on some of his questions, which is the rest of the world going to wait until the United States has built back better, until we are sort of ready to compete? And my concern is the answer to that question is no. And so what happens in this interim period, I think, is one of the things to watch, whether the United States ends up with a successful trade program.
Well, I don't know if we're good. Greg, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah,
Mix it up.
Okay, well, a little bit. Thanks, John. So I completely agree with Jennifer. I just, it's also linked to the China policy, not only from a national security perspective, but from an economic one, going back to the China shock and its impact on U.S. communities and U.S. workers. I think one has to see domestic policy is central to the Biden administration's international trade law policy, and this is where it's under real constraints. Worker-centered trade policy will only work if we pass bolder domestic initiatives to enhance security for workers, trade adjustment assistance, and so forth, building infrastructure to an extent which we're not even close to where China is. And the Biden administration is constrained. It's broader Social Security bills or proposals are uncertain, and its infrastructure bill was seriously cut back. So this is going to hamper its ability to take a lead in trade policy. And in my view, it's right, as Jennifer said, to go slower on trade, where trade can adversely affect workers, and we simply don't have the domestic policies in place to assure that they will benefit.
I just have a question about whether the administration may, in a sense, due to the changing conditions of the U.S. economy, may be pushed in this direction to think more carefully about trade. There's been a lot written these days about the effects of this so-called deglobalization. Jennifer, you mentioned the Buy America policies. Tariffs remain in place. We see rates of inflation in the U.S. that we haven't seen. Yet these are, the tariffs are remaining in place. Some of these policies are continuing. How, in the context of this success, how do these other factors play in?
Yeah, I would say that the administration, the number one concern obviously has to be, in addition to COVID, is the economy, not sure those two are connected. But inflation has been kept at bay for 30 years in no small part because of global competition, supply chains, immensely complex supply chains throughout the globe. So I think, while there's a dispute among economists right now as to whether this inflation is transitional or long term, time will tell. But I think at a minimum, in the near term, the administration has to be concerned about inflation, and to the extent that disruptions in the supply chain or tariffs are adding to inflationary pressures, I think that is a legitimate concern. So from my perspective as an unreformed free trader, I would say that, an administration's success, this administration's success for me would be, if it avoids violating the Hippocratic oath of doing harm. And I think while I would like to see some of these tariffs dialed back, especially those that have not really given us any leverage over China, some perhaps have, but many have not. I would like to see us dial back some of those tariffs and some other steps the administration could take in terms of trade liberalization. But as Jennifer mentioned, those just don't seem to be on offer. So I don't, wait by the phone for things that won't happen. But if we can, frankly, at this point in time where there's the winds of illiberalism are blowing on many fronts, not only trade, but seriously on the domestic front, some of the things we've seen in this country, I think we need to sort of recognize that, there's only so much that we can expect, those of us who would like to see more trade liberalization. There's only so much more, so much of that we can expect in this administration at these times. And to the extent the administration is focused seriously on other issues, education, skills training, competition that help the economy and provide jobs, that is a better and more fruitful path, I think, than trying to fight the last trade.
Kathleen, did you want to come in on any of that?
Well, I agree with much of what's been said. I agree with John that I think we have to look at this in the short term and the long term. In the short term, it's also a lot of sort of keep your options open while you make incremental progress on some of the areas that all of the prior speakers have raised. There are a number of wild cards in here that have also been mentioned, the sort of workability and reasonability of doing things with COVID. There's Congress and all those domestic features that have been discussed. So I think it's important to sort of recognize our starting point. Coming from the last administration, it's hard to break down some of what's happened, given that everyone agrees the problems are still the problems. But I think the administration wants to be in a position to say in the short term, hey, we recognize the problems. We didn't like the way that they dealt with those, and here's how we're going to do it better. That's what's, I think, starting to come out more. And in the longer term, there's a longer wish list, of course, and that includes asking, what's our vision of the U.S. economy going forward? Something that, measuring success on that metric is going to take a great deal of time. It's going to involve all these sort of inclusive points that Jennifer referred to, the different aspects of the worker-centered trade policy and beyond.
So let me pick up on a couple of points that have been coming out, and particularly the domestic constraint piece, the domestic political constraint piece, which is obviously pretty central here in thinking about what the administration does and where it can go, and tied in a little bit to the point that Jennifer pulled out before about the rest of the world is not standing still. How does the US re-engage given domestic constraints? And I want to come back to two developments and get the panel's reaction. One is in the absence of, re-engaging on a typical trade negotiation, what the administration obviously has done is developed a specific working mechanism with Europe, the Trade and Technology Council, and maybe not quite the analog in the Asia Pacific, but we've got the Quad, which has got a variety of things in there, but you've got a grouping that are working on some trade-related issues. And then you've got this announcement I mentioned in the introduction by Secretary Raimondo about a new sort of economic framework that is more or different to a trade agreement. I guess my question is, to what extent is there an emerging vision here of a new approach to international economic engagement, which is different to the way we've done it in the past, which is sort of a traditional FTA? And is this something that is potentially going to have legs and could be an alternative to a traditional trade negotiation going forward? Any of your views on whether that's a trajectory and what that might look like, I think would be an interesting start here. Jennifer.
Well, again, I think it's a great question, and I do think there is some serious legs to a couple of the things that came out of both the TTC and this idea of the Indo-Pacific. And to me, a lot of that gets to the issue of standards and technology standards. I mean, standards across a lot of things. An awful lot of where we're seeing, for example, the competition coming out of China and in other ways is this ability to set standards in a way that redounds, again, China has done this very extensively in a way that redounds to the benefit of Chinese producers of all kinds of things, from telecommunications on down. But China has been able to, in essence, flood the zone of standards around 5G, around all kinds of things, both by market share, just dominate the market, but secondly, by dominating the standard setting organizations. And because so much trade now, particularly in this digital world, trades in a lot of ways according to standards, I think the United States was smart. The Biden administration was really smart to approach this European Union TTC as focusing on, can we work together in order to develop standards around the technology that we're going to need to fight climate change, around the technology around artificial intelligence, around sort of data standards, and a lot of the things that are in the broad space of digital trade. To do that in a common way is absolutely yes, is the answer to your question. That is sort of the way to go, and something that is going to make a significant difference. And if we can do the same thing in this Indo-Pacific agreement, again, that will definitely benefit the US's ability to be a leader in semiconductors, in AI, in a whole series of technologies. The downside of it is what you're clearly going to see is where we are going to lose out in Asia, where we are already losing out in Asia, is, again, you look at it, China put together RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a huge agreement that includes, Japan and Korea and Australia and China and New Zealand and all of the ASEAN countries. What's key there is it has common rules of origin. So if you use a part made from any one of those huge economies in Asia, you fall under these common rules of origin. You have much easier customs clearance. You have clear, understandable duties. What does that do? That creates a huge incentive to source all of your parts within that RCEP region. Okay, in the absence of a trade agreement with rules of origin, we're not going to get there. And nor are we going to get a seat at the table when the RCEP ministers meet, as they do very, very frequently. We're not at that table. So on the one hand, this whole model of using the kind of standards approach and trying to create something less than a trade agreement is way better than nothing. And again, I think does advance some really important goals, but it has significant shortcomings.
I would just second everything Jennifer said. I think standard setting is the most important thing the U.S. can focus on right now, reasonably, since we know broad trade, gold standard trade agreements are not on offer these days. The standard setting and work with our like-minded countries around the world on standards is the most important thing I think this administration can do, because if China is able to, force, some more self-dealing type standards on other countries, other jurisdictions around the world, that is a huge problem for the U.S. that we need to confront, and this administration needs to make, in my humble opinion, its highest priority.
Greg.
Yeah. So I agree. It was really succinctly put by Jennifer. We are going to lose out if China remains and even grows, more importantly, as the chief trading partner for the countries in the region. That trajectory has developed, and it's going to continue with the RCEP and with the U.S. saying we don't want to engage in any sort of negotiations of a free trade agreement, rejoining CPTPP. in Asia. So those are the facts on the ground. I think with respect to standard setting, clearly the US and Europe always dominated standard setting. So what's new is suddenly there's a new player in the block. And so they, rather than just being rivals, they now are trying to work together with respect to this new player in the block. But I think we're missing, the one thing that hasn't been raised is this is also potentially about export controls and trying to keep key parts from China. And this is going to be much more challenging for the administration because countries in Asia, China is their most important trading partner. They are very wary of being told that they can't access U.S. technology if they trade with China in building any parts that they then sell to China. And so this is going to be very difficult to navigate.
Let me pick up on the China piece then, and this point you make, Greg, about China being a key trading partner really for so many countries in the Asia Pacific. I'm for those who are confused by my accent, Australian, so I'm well aware of that dynamic. But you know, it complicates the situation enormously. This is a new strategic domain for the US, and how to navigate that. So what does, let me ask you a pointed question here. What does that mean for China's desire to join CPTPP? My understanding is that it is the largest export market for 9 of the 11 CPTPP member countries. There's going to be a lot of domestic pressure in a number of these countries, in addition to Chinese pressure to welcome their accession. How does that play out? What does that look like to you?
I imagine the U.S. is in dialogue with key allies such as Australia, such as Japan, to ensure that doesn't happen. But just the fact that China already is part of the RCEP in trading with these countries. And one thing with respect to the rules of origin of RCEP, they're actually much more liberal than in the CPTPP. And then with what the US is proposing, were the even rejoin an agreement. So I think that China will not join this particular agreement simply because of national security and close ties with allies in the region. But that's not going to stop China from increasing sort of trade ties and economic ties with these countries vis-a-vis the United States.
And I had just a couple little bells and whistles on that. You know, I would totally agree with Greg, but, you know, a couple of little things. I mean, people should recognize that at the same time, China is, you know, bidding to get into the CPT. So is the UK, and so is Taiwan. And, you know, and again, I think the issue of, you know, how countries think about that issue with respect to Taiwan is another, you know, very interesting wrinkle and or potential deterrence for China, because it's very clear, again, that joining the CPTPP requires the consensus of all of the members. And so the concern on the Taiwanese end is if China gets in first, they're likely to block Taiwan's accession to the CPTPP, which I think many in the region would say we can't accept that. And vice versa, it goes the other way if Taiwan gets in first. And yet if you look at the actual terms of the CPTPP, there's many provisions that China arguably can't meet. I mean, many of the provisions with respect to state-owned enterprises, subsidies, labor, you know, again, China is not in compliance with it. And so the issue is whether any kind of a process can be developed to try to bring China up to those standards, or whether the perception is simply China is not, you know, and cannot be ready. And then the last little wrinkle to remember is that within the USMCA is language that basically says none of the USMCA partners, and that would be both Canada and Mexico are members of the CPTPP, are supposed to allow a non-market economy to enter into a free trade agreement with a non-market economy. Now, we could debate whether the CPTPP fits into that category of free trade agreement and whether China definitively fits into the non-market economy category, but it's very clear that there's a lot of hurdles, if you will, that I would say are also part of the reason why I completely agree with Greg. I think it is unlikely that China is going to get into the CPTPP anytime soon.
I would agree with Greg as well on that front, although part of me would like to see that the Vegas odds on that changing a little bit insofar as it could motivate this administration to take more seriously its own contemplation of joining that agreement.
I mean, you would have to imagine that at a minimum, even not formally having a smooth pathway, just being in the queue means that there's a process that makes it harder to bring in other countries, in a sense, if you don't seriously take China's bid, I guess. So the Taiwan piece, I think that plays out there perfectly well. Nina.
Yeah, well, let's stay on this topic of I think of U.S. China. Maybe we can shift over into the more the bilateral piece. So, you know, we talked about the kind of the scorecard for the administration on broader trade policy. What about on China? And any thoughts on outlook for where things are headed, both from a U.S. perspective and just given you know, all of the events that are happening in China, including Xi Jinping's changes of the domestic approaches that that the Chinese government is taking towards private sector conduct. Yeah, can I turn it to you all?
All right, I'll jump into these dangerous waters first. First of all, I think we don't know really what is happening in China. You know, everyone on this panel and in the audience reads, you know, a story a day. One suggesting that China is a house of cards economically about to fall. The other that, you know, we will quote all the working with Chinese companies in 10 years. So what the fate is obviously somewhere in between. But I think China is clearly has some domestic struggles. Transparency is obviously an issue to knowing the extent of those. But, you know, for what it's worth, I subscribe, have become convinced of the argument that some of the consolidation of President Xi and some of his efforts and actions to reduce power centers in the economic sector and elsewhere are due to concerns about growth in those power centers and the challenges to the sole authority of the party. So I think there's a lot that will unfold in China that we have little control over, but will affect us in the bilateral relationship immensely. I think for this administration, I think they're, you know, just speaking politically, they have a little bit of a challenge. They certainly can't afford to appear, you know, soft on China in comparison to the last administration. By the same token, it's hard to imagine big wins. I think the last administration itself knew there wouldn't be big wins on that front. The last administration hoped for was to put an end to, you know, the status quo ante. But I think the administration is going to be cautious in putting and recognizing that they are unlikely to have big trade wins on China, because that would require China making changes that very few people expect them to make, but also recognizing, this administration is recognizing that the trade policy really needs to be subordinated into a broad geopolitical framework for U.S.-China. And that is a fast evolving situation in light of Hong Kong. And now, you know, Taiwan, you know, has always been an issue. And now we're getting closer to, you know, that landscape, which was fairly stable, complex but stable, you know, is less stable than it was 5 years ago.
Can I jump in on this? Although Greg has just written this masterful article about this issue, so I will be eager to hear from him shortly. But I thought I would just respond a little bit to some of what John said, or add on more from a USG perspective. Like if we're looking at this from within the U.S. government, I think the administration sort of sees there's a lot of possibilities on the table, and I just want to pick up two: one, USTR specific, and then second is beyond USTR. I think within USTR, and those who work with it. There's trade war fatigue, and yet no end in sight for the importers and exporters who are dealing with these issues, but also a sense from maybe the rest of the world, those of us who are not on the regular importing and exporting things, that this is sort of business as usual now, that it's sort of been normalized, this concept of our trade war. And that was actually part of the message that Ambassador Tai delivered, saying that when she looked at the deal that was negotiated by the last administration, it stabilized tensions in a way, also maintaining a status quo and realigning the relationship was the word that she used. So I think going forward, we would expect USTR to still be holding, as it is, China accountable for the prior administration's commitments, to still want to be the sort of shiny end of the spear, so to speak. But even as that's the aim, these other issues to which John has mentioned, subsidies, forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, the big issues remain unaddressed. And I don't think we're going to see an aggressive pursuit of them. As he has said, it's not particularly realistic in the short term or on our own. Plus, if we dial it up too soon, what space do you have left? So I think, again, the Biden administration wants to say, here are going to be our innovative approaches to dealing with this. There was talk about new 301s, maybe shifting some of the tariffs to new 301s, but apparently no appetite for that at the moment. There's, of course, litigation happening on the 301 tariffs that we'll continue to watch. So that's sort of, I think, the thinking within USTR. And then very briefly on the beyond USTR, I think to manage all of this and all that the China problem, capital P, involves, we have to look elsewhere, right? That's not just a USTR thing, as John had said. Many coercive economic and non-economic strategies on the table, plus the competitiveness packages, of course, have China in the background. So there really need to be, and will be, I think, an all of government approach in which USTR is just one piece.
Yep, Greg.
Sure, thanks. So, I mean, obviously this is the key issue of our time, right? Not only for trade, but much more broadly. And the risk of serious conflict between China and the United States needs to be managed. So we need to have an ongoing relationship, and trade is going to be part of that. I think it's important also for people in the United States to recognize that just as the United States is not monolithic, China is not monolithic. Clearly, we've seen major changes under President Xi, but we also see sort of dynamic issues in China, which are similar to concerns that we have in the United States, such as part of his going after large companies is concerns about inclusiveness of and the benefits of economic growth being broadly spread throughout the Chinese population. And of course, he's worried about this not simply for being reelected because it's not a democracy, but for basic sort of support for the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is very central. The second concern is that clearly what the United States does triggers reactions in China, so that if we're trying to cut off China from access for key resources, this is also was Japan's concern right before World War II. And so we need to manage this very carefully. If everything becomes national security and China is simply placed as an enemy, we're going down a path which is a very dangerous one, especially given China's size, its importance, and its importance in Asia, which is the fastest growing region in the world. So we need to manage China as a reality, our relationship with it. Third is that we have our own real domestic challenges with respect to political polarization, which creates incentives for us to make really bad decisions. China is managing the tariff situation vis-a-vis the United States much more rationally than we are with China. The big tariffs that we pose on China are on inputs to the U.S. Manufacturing products, which puts us at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Whereas for final consumer products, we don't have high tariffs, and that's purely for domestic political reasons, because we don't want consumers to be worried about high prices on toys and things, consumer items that they buy from China. But for inputs for manufacturing, this makes no sense the way we structured it. It's completely non-optimal from an economic perspective or a national security perspective. But it's hard to understand what we can really do about this given the polarized political situation in the United States. And then finally, so what do we do? What should we do with China? Well, my own view is that it's really mistaken to think that the WTO rules are dysfunctional and need to be completely reformed in order to have a successful sort of interface with respect to the US and Chinese systems. And that's what my article is all about with Kathleen. To me, there are really three different aspects of managing the US-China relationship. One is just economic. We have different forms of capitalism, state capitalism, and a much more free market-oriented capitalism. How do you sort of manage this interface, in particular with respect to Chinese subsidies and state-owned enterprises? I think current WTO rules and China's accession agreement, which is actually provides a lot of additional rules that could be used vis-a-vis China to an extent that we haven't done so. Second, that with respect to national security, China has very similar concerns on national security as the United States. So I think this can be managed under current WTO rules. And third, with respect to social policy, which has been mentioned with respect to forced labor and other issues, I think this is being developed through other free trade agreements or trade agreements that the United States has adopted. It was mentioned the USMCA. We could bring many of those provisions were taken from the TPP, but then they were expanded upon, as Jennifer mentioned. We could bring those back to a new TPP negotiation. And so the only reason why we're not carrying forward and it would be a much more rational policy is domestic politics, which is hampering us.
And just as a final sort of note, to me, it was interesting to think about the sort of implications of Catherine Tai's speech about China. And I wouldn't disagree with John. I mean, when a lot of us heard it on this side of the ocean, if you will, there was a sense of there's not a lot of there. And I'm going to just slightly disagree and say, a couple of interesting things. One is when you talk to people in Asia, particularly in China, their response to the speech was quite different and quite positive, in part because of a couple of, again, sort of key phrases or key concepts that Catherine Tai threw out. One is this notion of that there will be a durable coexistence between the United States and China. Again, very welcome news on the Asian side. She used the notion of that we will recouple rather than decouple from China. So again, a lot of sort of interesting things. And then to me, I think you heard some different messaging. One is that the Trump administration really did not put much emphasis at all on state-owned enterprises and subsidies. They were all about the bilateral deficit and about, to some degree, IP and tech, but not about subsidies, which was an awful lot of what drove the United States and China in such different directions. And secondly, again, a clear emphasis out of that speech and out of the Biden administration writ large on working with allies and partners. And here's where I do think you have to give the Biden administration significant credit for what came out of the G7 and to some degree the G20 at bringing allies and partners together around this issue of we need to think about what is China doing that is unfair, that is causing disruption in the market, and figure out whether we can collectively work on those issues without it blossoming into a much broader effort. But that the G7 countries need to be responsive to what China is doing in its Belt and Road Initiative and to what China is doing with this whole notion of the non-market economy subsidy state-owned enterprises, but in a collective common way. And I do think that is going to be, I hope, the Biden administration's path forward on this.
That's an excellent way of putting it, Jennifer. And I want to pick up on a couple of these points here. I mean, there's a lot going on there, but I do want to bring it back explicitly to the WTO piece and tied in with some of what Angela was talking about previously. I guess my basic question is how calibrated and effective is the US position vis-a-vis the WTO at the moment, and what more could be done? Specifically, I mean, Greg, you've spoken about this, Jennifer, you've written about this a lot in terms of using the dispute settlement function more effectively vis-a-vis China. But to what extent, I mean, Kathleen, you've spoken, I think, extremely well about, and John, you made this point about the trade policy being subordinate to broader foreign policy objectives. And the key one, I think, we would all agree is managing China. And so it needs to be understood in that context. And the WTO then again is a smaller part of that broader set of trade policy tools the US will use. But looking at the WTO through the lens of the challenge that China presents the US and allies, What more do you think this administration could be doing at the WTO to more effectively get at that piece?
Well, maybe I'll start. Part of it is to try to figure out if there is any way to bring somewhat more of what is the US-China trade war, if you will, under the auspices of the WTO. Because I do not think it helps a multilateral institution when the two largest trading countries in the world are having a trade dispute that is largely outside of the confines of the WTO. To me, it isn't saying anything very, very good about the institution itself and about where it's headed. And for most of the other members of the WTO, it is a little bit of the African proverb. I mean, when the elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. And so everybody is trying to sort of not be that grass underneath these elephants, and that is not a good position going forward. So where I think the WTO and its rules system has failed the most is on the ability to discipline subsidies. And again, I've written at length about this. I won't go on, but just to say that the current subsidy disciplines do not work. And so part of what I think the United States is doing, and I commend the Biden administration for picking back up on the efforts that the Trump administration began, this sort of tri-level cooperative program with the United States, the European Union, and Japan, to rewrite the rules on how are we going to think about and discipline subsidies and tech transfer, and then to figure out a way to bring those new rules, if we can agree upon them, into the WTO so that they are applicable to China. And I would agree with also with the premise of your question. We need to use the WTO rules and the WTO dispute settlement system much more effectively in terms of challenging China. I mean, right now, at some level, China has the high road at the WTO. They're pointing at the United States and saying it's the United States that's violated all the rules. The United States put on unilateral tariffs. The United States, the United States, the United States. And China right now has the high road. And again, this should not have been allowed to happen. So I think we need to figure out a way to bring some of this China-US dispute within the WTO and make sure that we have rules in place that can actually get at what our real problems are with China.
Who wants to add to that, or Greg?
Sure. I can agree and disagree slightly with Jennifer, which is I think the idea that WTO subsidies rules simply don't work is mistaken. I think those rules do discipline export subsidies, specific subsidies, and so forth. And in a world in which we have major challenges such as the pandemic, such as national security rivalries on semiconductors, such as climate change policy, I think we're going to see an enhanced role of the state. And the idea, I think if we put all of our sort of the only way that the WTO function is to have new rules on subsidies. One, I think it's going to be very difficult to pull off, not only just politically, but also just intellectually. I think it's really difficult to try to determine how to rein in subsidies, including for the United States, where the Biden administration and the Trump administration earlier has thrown a lot of money given the current challenges that we face. And so I think that you can manage the interface of different forms of capitalism with much more modest tweaks to WTO rules or their interpretation of them. I think where I completely agree with Jennifer is a counterfact. I think that one has to ask a question on WTO dispute settlement as a counterfactual. Nothing institutionally is going to be perfect in terms of any one member's views. But counterfactually, one has to ask oneself, is the United States better off in its relationship with China with WTO dispute settlement or without? And I think clearly we would be much better off being able to challenge China's policies with WTO dispute settlement than what we've seen of destroying that system and now facing basically 20% tariffs, which are much less optimally designed by the United States than by China vis-a-vis each other.
Oh, John, you go.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, Kathleen, then John.
Thanks. I think I'm going to disagree a little bit with what's been said. And from the following perspective, I hear a lot these days in Geneva, in other parts of the world, about concerns about the relevance of the WTO. Disillusionment is a word that's been used. Credibility concerns is another that I've seen. I think each of the speakers in making those comments, they mean different things. They're not all consistent. And I think a lot of these concerns are overblown. But some of that is coming from a sense that other institutions are being used more effectively to deal with problems than the WTO is. That they're going to places like the OECD stands out among them. And I want to say, perhaps controversially, that I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that we can use the WTO to achieve other goals for which it is very well positioned, rather than put more weight on this organization that's already heavily weighed down, such as something as big as U.S.-China issues.
I would just add, I mean, I think the initial question we had for this panel was asking us to score the the Biden administration. And Jennifer, you said, well, you got to sort of do it on a scale. And I would say scoring the WTO for me similarly should be on a scale. And relative to other international organizations, I think it's still pretty effective. As Angela said in her comments and says, emphasized, it's a membership organization. And I don't think we can expect the WTO as an institution to be more liberalizing vis-a-vis trade than its members, the attitude of its members. And to my chagrin, since Doha, actually, well, since the Uruguay round, there just hasn't been an appetite for liberalization. So there hasn't been liberalization. As far as the dispute settlement, I was the general counsel when we brought the U.S. brought the case against Europe for the Airbus subsidies. If in 2004 you had asked me if that case would still be going on today in 2021, I would have bet my house that it would not have. So I thank my wife and kids are thankful that I did not take that bet. But it's I think the DSU, Jennifer, you served on it, the Appellate Body. I mean, I think it suffers from a more fundamental problem than some of the problems of overreaching that the last administration and the previous administration that highlighted. And I think it's about, what you can expect from a dispute settlement, just more generally. Dispute settlement entities, regimes have to rely on one of three models. One is a highly legalistic one. We've all purchased a home. Those are very long purchase and sale agreements. They cover everything from shrubs to windows. And you kind of know in great detail how any contingency would be resolved. Trade agreements are never going to be that detailed, and therefore a highly legalistic approach to enforcing trade agreements seems to me unlikely and viable. We could alternatively have courts of equity, which we have in this country, and frankly, I think they serve a very good function of serving justice. But I haven't met many people who want the Appellate Body or WTO panels generally to operate as courts of equity. And that would invite lots of concerns, legitimate concerns. So I think we're left with a diplomatic model. And in that sense, I think we need to sort of just recognize that after 20 years of the DSU, that we're left with a diplomatic resolution to these matters. And the good offices of the WTO and the DSU need to be used to allow the parties to resolve these matters, as opposed to expecting matters to resolve themselves in a way that, an Article 3 court can resolve things in the US and parties abide by those or risk contempt. That is just not the world I think we can expect at the end of a DSU proceeding.
Well, it's pretty clear based on this conversation that we could probably go on for quite a while on the ground that we've already covered and ground that we haven't gotten to. But unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time for this event. And on behalf of Josh and myself, we just wanted to thank our panelists for your time and for this really very interesting conversation. There's just a lot more to be said on this, and we look forward to picking this up and at a future time. So thank you again.
Great, thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right.